July 1944. Deep beneath the ruined fortifications near Cherbourg, the cave smelled of smoke, blood, and damp stone. For days, German nurses had worked by candlelight, their hands trembling as they boiled and reboiled bandages, stretching the last drops of morphine across a dozen wounded men.
No idea.
Schwester Ilse pressed her back against the wall, whispering to a colleague that the Americans surely exaggerated their strength. No one could possess such endless medicine, she muttered, her voice half plea, half denial. She believed it, or perhaps she needed to believe it. In the suffocating dark, doubt was easier than despair. When the surrender came, it was not with thunder, but with silence. The candles were snuffed out.
You're welcome.
The wounded groaned. And one by one, the nurses were ordered to raise their hands. Ilse stepped forward first, eyes blinking against the daylight she had not seen in days. The light stung, almost cruel in its brightness, and for a brief moment, she longed for the safety of the shadows. Behind her, 8 women followed, their white coats stained brown with dried blood, faces hollow yet defiant. They expected ridicule, perhaps cruelty, certainly shortages no different than their own. But waiting for them was not mockery. Instead, American officers studied them with something stranger, something softer curiosity. They were prisoners, yes, but they were also healers. And within hours, these women would be led into a world that contradicted every lesson drilled into them about enemy weakness and German superiority. They would see shelves of supplies they had only heard of in rumors, techniques that seemed like miracles, kindness from strangers they had been taught to hate. None of them knew, as they squinted into that July sunlight, that their entire faith in war, medicine, and even themselves was about to unravel. The summer of 1944 hung heavy over the battered coast of Normandy. The air itself seemed torn between life and death, thick with smoke that refused to drift away, as if the ruins of war clung stubbornly to the land. Beneath the shattered fortifications near Cherbourg lay a hospital that could barely be called one. A cavern hollowed into the rock, its walls slick with damp, its ceilings dripping cold water that fell like steady tears onto the stone floor. For days, for weeks, this underground warren had been the world of 9 German nurses. Their hands were cracked from scrubbing, their eyes hollow from sleepless nights, their white coats long since turned gray with soot and brown with dried blood. Schwester Ilse, her hair matted to her temples, leaned close to the flame of a guttering candle, squinting as she tried to thread a needle with shaking fingers. Around her, the air smelled of sickness, sweat, rotting flesh, smoke, iodine when they had it, and nothing but boiled water when they did not. She whispered to Greta, the nurse who crouched beside her, "The Americans cannot possibly have what they claim. They lie. They exaggerate. It's all propaganda." Her voice was thin, stretched by exhaustion, but still carried the stubborn certainty of someone who needed to believe. To admit otherwise, here in the dark, was to admit they had been abandoned by everything they had sworn was strong. They worked by candlelight, because the generator had failed weeks earlier. They rationed morphine until the last vial was drained, stretched sulfa powder until the tin was scraped bare. Bandages were boiled, dried, and used again, the cloth, stiff and brittle, carrying the stains of men who had already died on it. Every breath seemed to echo with futility, yet still they moved, still they bound wounds, still they murmured words of comfort to soldiers who would not live to see another dawn. Each gesture was less about saving lives than about clinging to the remnants of duty. Then the silence came. No roar of battle, no fresh flood of wounded, no distant rattle of machine guns. Only the strange quiet of surrender, a sound that felt heavier than any bombardment. Orders drifted down into the cavern like falling ash. Lay down your instruments. Raise your hands. Step into the light. The nurses looked at one another, faces pale and drawn. Some bit their lips until they bled. Others simply stared, numb. Ilse swallowed hard, pressed a trembling hand against the rough wall, and forced herself to move. The first step upward was agony, her legs weak, her knees trembling. The second step carried with it a rush of panic what awaited them above. Punishment, cruelty, Hunger no different from their own? She did not know. She only knew the air grew warmer, brighter, and unbearably sharp. When she emerged at last, she gasped, raising a hand against the blazing daylight. She had not seen the sun in days. It blinded her, struck her like a whip across the eyes. For a fleeting moment, she longed to retreat into the safe misery of the cavern. Darkness, at least, was familiar. But there was no retreat. Behind her, the others followed. Greta, Marta, Anna, Ruth. Their coats hung loose, streaked with filth, sleeves stiff with dried blood. Their faces looked older than their years, eyes ringed in black, lips cracked from thirst. They were 9 women carrying not just exhaustion, but the weight of a collapsing world. Each one had been raised to believe in German superiority, trained to repeat the same words of strength and destiny, taught that America was weak, indulgent, broken by depression, and incapable of sustaining war. That belief was the last thin wall keeping them from despair. Now, squinting in the light, they braced for mockery, for humiliation. They expected American voices to sneer, to confirm what German propaganda had told them about barbaric enemies. They expected shortages, perhaps worse deprivation than their own. They did not expect the silence that greeted them, nor the calm, assessing eyes of the American officer who stood waiting. Colonel Richard P. Johnson of the 45th Evacuation Hospital did not shout. He did not threaten. He studied them, as one might study colleagues arriving late to a ward shift, wary but not unkind. He saw not enemies but fellow healers, women whose hands bore the same scars his own nurses carried. His gaze unsettled Ilse more than hatred would have. Hatred she could endure. Hatred would have confirmed her world. But curiosity, even compassion, that was harder to withstand. As the sun glared overhead and the ruins of Cherbourg smoked behind them, the nurses stood uncertain, prisoners yet not reviled, captives yet still professionals in white. They had no idea what awaited them. But they felt, in the pit of their stomachs, that something was shifting. Hours earlier, they had clung to the story that America was weak. Now, as trucks rumbled in the distance and the smell of disinfectant, not decay, floated faintly on the breeze, they sensed their faith would not last much longer. Ilse turned her face away from the officer's gaze, blinking back sudden tears she could not explain. It was not grief, nor relief, but something heavier, stranger. She did not know it then, but the ground beneath her beliefs had begun to crack. Within hours, within days, she would see sights that no amount of propaganda could erase. Shelves stocked with medicine she had only heard of in rumors. Techniques that seemed like miracles. The astonishing reality that enemies could treat her with dignity. For now, though, she only knew the sting of daylight, the ache in her limbs, and the echo of her own whispered denial in the cave. The Americans cannot possibly have what they claim. The words felt foolish already. The silence of surrender was all around her, and it carried with it the faintest promise, not of defeat, but of revelation. And so, 9 women stood together on the broken ground of France, coats stained, eyes hollow, hearts guarded. They did not yet realize that the path before them would not be measured in miles or months, but in the collapse of one world and the birth of another. They had walked out of darkness expecting chains. What they would find instead was light, and with it, the unraveling of everything they thought they knew. The march away from Cherbourg was quiet, but not in the way of peace. It was the silence of the defeated, the silence of boots dragging over broken stone, the silence of women who no longer knew what tomorrow might demand. Ilse felt the weight of her medical satchel hanging useless at her side, its contents reduced to scraps, a broken thermometer, 2 chipped syringes, a length of gauze already stiff with blood. She clutched it anyway, as though holding on to this empty bag meant she still carried purpose. The Americans who guarded them walked with rifles slung, but their eyes were not full of rage. They looked past the nurses, scanning the horizon, alert but strangely calm. That, more than any weapon, unsettled Ilse. When the convoy reached the port, the women stopped short. Looming in the harbor were ships unlike anything they had been told existed, gray giants, squat and functional, lined with cranes and pulleys that moved like an assembly line of steel. Liberty ships, the Americans called them. To Ilse, they looked less like vessels and more like factories set adrift. She whispered to Greta, "They build these in weeks, they say." Greta shook her head sharply, unwilling to believe. "No ship can be made in weeks. It is impossible." Another American lie. But as they watched cargo roll aboard, crates marked with red crosses and barrels of supplies so numerous that dockhands barely paused for breath, Ilse felt the first hairline fracture of doubt. The journey across the Atlantic should have been misery. They expected cramped holds, stale bread, thirst that clawed at the throat. Instead, they found rows of bunks, clean linen, and a mess hall where food was not just plentiful but almost obscene in its variety. Bread, butter, canned fruit, coffee, steaming hot. The women ate mechanically at first, suspicion coiled tight in their stomachs. Ilse pushed a piece of apple pie across her tray, its sweetness foreign, almost threatening. She thought of soldiers in the cave hospital, who had died with nothing in their mouths but the taste of smoke and blood. The contrast was unbearable, but it was the medical ward on board that broke the rhythm of their disbelief. At first, they were taken there as patients themselves, examined by young American doctors who smelled faintly of soap and starch instead of smoke and sweat. One nurse, Ruth, had developed a festering cut on her hand. She expected the same crude treatment they had used: underground boil water, bind with rag, pray for no infection. Instead, the American medic unwrapped a sterile bandage, applied an ointment whose name she did not know, and produced a vial of crystalline liquid. Penicillin, he called it. Within a day, the swelling receded, the redness drained away as though chased by invisible hands. Ruth stared at her hand as if it were no longer hers. "This cannot be real," she whispered. Ilse watched plasma transfusions performed with a smoothness she had never seen. In her world, blood was drawn clumsily, poured from vein to vein, risking fever and death as often as it saved life. Here, glass bottles gleamed with carefully typed plasma, chilled and catalogued, waiting like soldiers ready for deployment. She saw a wounded German prisoner, pale and gasping, carried in on a stretcher. Without hesitation, the Americans hung a bottle of plasma, inserted a needle, and within hours the man's breathing eased. He lived. It was not miracle, not magic. It was simply abundance. Abundance that Germany could not conjure. X-ray machines clattered and hummed in a corner room. Ilse hesitated at the door, remembering the rare moments she had glimpsed such equipment back in Germany, reserved only for the most critical officers or wealthy patients. Here, even ordinary soldiers were screened, their broken bones illuminated like fragile branches on glowing plates. One of the American technicians, barely more than a boy, held up the film with pride. "Fractured ulna," he explained in accented German, pointing to the shadowy crack. Ilse stared, her throat tight. She had diagnosed fractures by touch, by pain, by guesswork in the dark. To see inside the body so clearly, it felt like stepping into another century. Still, the nurses clung to denial. Greta said it most often, her voice sharp as a blade. "It is theater. They show us what they want us to see. The abundance is a trick." Marta nodded fiercely beside her. "They waste to impress us. Wait long enough, and you'll see. Their cupboards will run bare." The others echoed agreement, needing to believe that this flood of supplies was temporary, a mask hiding weakness. For if it was not a mask, if it was real, then everything they had been taught about strength and survival was a lie. Ilse tried to join in, to nod when Greta spoke, but in the quiet of her bunk at night she replayed the images. Ruth's healed hand, the prisoner breathing again, the X-ray film glowing against the light. She thought of the cave in Cherbourg, the reeking bandages stiff as bark, the soldiers who bled out while she pressed her palms helplessly to their wounds. She thought of whispering, "The Americans cannot possibly have what they claim." Yet, she had touched the bottle of penicillin herself. She had felt the cool glass, had watched it banish infection like a storm dissolving in sunlight. The ship carried them onward, day after day, and with each sunrise the evidence mounted. Sterile instruments laid out in neat rows, medications stored in climate-controlled cabinets, autoclaves that sterilized in minutes instead of hours. The Americans worked without hesitation, without rationing, as though the war had not drained them at all. The nurses could not ignore it, yet they could not embrace it either. So they lived in the fragile space between denial and dawning recognition, hearts pulled taut like wires. One evening, Ilse stood alone at the rail, the sea wind cold against her face. Stars spread across the sky with careless abundance, no less overwhelming than the supplies she saw below deck. She thought of her father's words years ago. Strength comes from discipline, from sacrifice. She had believed him, carried that creed into the desert of Africa, into the caves of France. But now, gazing at the endless stars and the endless cargo in the hold, she wondered if strength might also come from something else: industry, generosity, even compassion. She pressed her forehead to the rail and closed her eyes. The thought frightened her, yet it would not leave. By the time the Liberty ship docked in America, the women were silent, each wrapped in her own turmoil. They had seen too much to believe fully in propaganda, but not enough to surrender their old convictions. When the gangplank lowered and they stepped onto foreign soil, they carried not just their satchels and their fatigue, but a gnawing uncertainty that weighed more heavily than chains. The world they had been promised was slipping away, and another was rising in its place, bright, abundant, bewildering. For Ilse, it was not yet conversion. It was not yet acceptance. It was something more fragile, more dangerous. The first cracks in a faith that had defined her entire life. And though she told herself still that it was only a show, a theater of abundance, deep inside, she already knew. The unraveling had begun. The harbor loomed larger than their imaginations had ever allowed. Norfolk, Virginia, just the name had been a whisper in German barracks, a place painted in propaganda as weak, crumbling, impoverished. Yet when Ilse and the other nurses stepped down the gangplank into the American sun, the city stretched before them with an energy that felt unstoppable. Buildings rose without scars, streets thrummed with movement, and everywhere they turned there seemed to be abundance trucks unloading crates of medical supplies, rows of ambulances gleaming in the light, young men in crisp uniforms moving with quiet efficiency. The world did not look broken here. It looked frighteningly alive. From the port they were herded, not roughly, but firmly, into waiting trains that carried them inland. The journey itself became a revelation. Through the windows, Ilse saw hospitals rising in every city, grand brick structures with white columns, their windows lit even in the daytime, as if electricity were a language America spoke without pause. In Richmond, the sprawling complex of the Medical College of Virginia slid past, larger than any hospital she had ever seen in Germany. In Philadelphia, the silhouette of Pennsylvania Hospital stood tall, an entire block dedicated to healing. Ilse pressed her forehead against the glass, whispering without realizing it. So many. Greta heard her and snapped back. Appearances deceive. Do not forget who we are. But even Greta's voice wavered. At Camp Opelika in Alabama, the first of many shocks awaited them. The hospital there was clean, bright, and so well equipped it might have been another world entirely. Instruments gleamed under fluorescent light. Sterilizers hissed with steam. Ilse froze when she saw shelves lined with rolls of bandages. Not the stiff, blood-stained cloth she had boiled and boiled again until it crumbled in her hands, but fresh white gauze, wrapped in paper, stacked high. An orderly took one, used it once, and then threw it away. Threw it away. Ilse's breath caught. In Cherbourg, she had watched soldiers die while she tried to wring one more use from a rag already soaked with the blood of 3 men. Here, they cast aside what she would have treasured. The pharmacy was worse or better, she could not decide. Rows of bottles labeled in neat English script: sulfa, quinine, morphine, penicillin. Shelves so full, the glass glinted like jewels. She thought of the last time she had rationed a single vial of morphine, cutting doses so thin that men screamed until their throats bled. She remembered how she had whispered lies into their ears. Soon it will take effect, because there was nothing left to give. Now, standing in that storeroom, her throat burned, as if those lies had followed her across the ocean. Meals were another blow. In the mess hall, Trays clattered with food that seemed endless. Bread still warm, meat piled high, potatoes steaming, butter in thick curls, vegetables bright with color, coffee poured without limit. And pie always pie, apple or cherry, its sweetness a cruel reminder of hunger's sting. The nurses ate stiffly, their jaws working in silence, while American guards laughed softly among themselves. Ilse watched a soldier leave half his tray untouched and dump it into a barrel. Waste. Unthinkable waste. Her stomach knotted, not with hunger but with shame. Shame that her wounded men had starved while their enemies discarded enough to save them all. At Glennon General Hospital in Oklahoma, the pattern repeated itself on a scale that left them numb. Operating rooms glowed under bright surgical lamps. Autoclaves sterilized instruments in minutes. Adjustable beds lifted and lowered with ease. Electrocardiographs traced the rhythm of beating hearts on long strips of paper, machines Ilse had only seen in textbooks, never in practice. The sheer normality with which Americans used these tools was the deepest wound. For them it was routine. For the nurses, it was revelation. One evening, Ilse stood by a window overlooking the hospital grounds. She could hear faint laughter drifting from the wards, patients and nurses talking as if war had not followed them here. She closed her eyes and saw again the cave in Cherbourg, men dying under candlelight, the silence broken only by moans, her hands slick with blood she could not stop. She had believed then that all armies suffered alike, that America's talk of abundance was a lie meant to break their morale. But here she was, surrounded by proof that it was no lie at all. Greta tried to resist. She muttered daily that this was theater, that the Americans staged abundance to break their spirits. Marta nodded, clinging to denial. Yet each day chipped away at those defenses. The women saw infections vanish with penicillin, saw limbs saved that they would have amputated, saw soldiers rise from beds they would have buried. No amount of stubbornness could erase the evidence before their eyes. For Ilse, the breaking point came with something small. She was assisting in a ward when an American nurse handed her a fresh bandage, smiling gently as if to say, "We are the same." Ilse wrapped it around the arm of a wounded prisoner, the clean cloth white against bruised skin. When she finished, the nurse simply offered another, as if there would always be more. In that moment, Ilse felt her chest tighten, tears threatening. Always more. For years, she had lived in a world of never enough. By the time summer deepened into autumn, the nurses no longer whispered about American lies. They did not speak of superiority or weakness. They walked the halls quietly, eyes wide, hearts heavy with a truth too vast to deny. Abundance was not theater. It was real, and it was everywhere. Their faith, once hard as stone, was crumbling grain by grain. They had stepped from darkness into light expecting chains, but what they found instead was a mirror that reflected not just their captors' strength, but their own nation's failures. And for the first time, Ilse admitted to herself softly, painfully, that the world she had trusted was collapsing. The light was no longer something she feared. It was something that burned, searing away the illusions she had carried across the sea. The first cracks in their certainty had come with the shelves of medicine, the endless food, the disposable bandages. But it was not the supplies that broke them, it was what those supplies were used for, and for whom. In Camp Opelika, and later at Glennon General Hospital, the German nurses watched with wide eyes as the Americans carried their wounded and laid them side by side with German prisoners. No distinction in treatment, no division in medicine. A man in gray field uniform groaned on the cot, next to a man in olive drab, both bleeding, both pale. The American doctors moved between them with the same hands, the same instruments, the same urgency. It was not favoritism, not charity. It was routine. Ilse felt her breath catch the first time she saw an American surgeon reach for penicillin and administer it to a German soldier before turning, without pause, to do the same for one of his own. She waited for a reprimand, for someone to object, for rules to be read aloud. None came. The room hummed with the sound of machines, the clatter of instruments, and the steady murmur of orders, but not one word marked a difference between friend and foe. For years, she had been taught that German lives carried more weight, that medicine was a tool to strengthen the race, not to save all who suffered. Yet here, in this brightly lit ward, that belief collapsed. The shock deepened when she and the others were assigned tasks. They had expected to be treated as prisoners fit only for menial labor, scrubbing floors, cleaning latrines. Instead, they were brought into the wards, handed clean aprons, and told to assist. But supervision came not only from American doctors. Standing at their side, correcting their movements with calm precision, were American nurses. Some were white, their faces open and brisk, and some were black. Ilse froze the first time a black nurse placed a hand over hers, guiding her in how to position an oxygen mask. The contact was firm, professional, without hesitation. "Like this," the nurse said softly. Her English accented but clear. Ilse's heart thundered in her chest. Everything in her training told her this was impossible, that someone her textbooks had declared inferior was not only her equal, but her teacher. She wanted to recoil, to resist, but the warmth of the hand lingered, steady and sure. The technique was correct. The patient breathed easier. The truth was undeniable. Day after day, the German nurses learned under their supervision. They saw women of every background, commanding knowledge, instructing with confidence. African American nurses directed entire wards of German prisoners, ensuring wounds were cleaned, medications given, charts updated. Ilse watched as one corrected a German orderly with crisp authority, then turned to comfort a prisoner in German so fluent it startled him. The orderly obeyed. No one questioned her. It was as though the very floor shifted beneath their feet. Nazi doctrine had promised them superiority, a hierarchy carved in stone. Here, that stone crumbled. The Americans built their practice not on bloodlines, but on training, not on purity, but on compassion. Medicine was not a tool of ideology. It was an act of humanity. At night, Ilse lay awake staring at the ceiling. She remembered her instructors in Berlin, men in white coats lecturing on racial hygiene, insisting that weak patients drained the strength of the nation. She remembered nodding, believing, repeating the words until they felt like truth. But now she had seen a man with a shattered leg. German, American, it did not matter. Rise again. Because of plasma, because of penicillin, because someone cared enough to save him. Weakness was not discarded here. It was healed. Greta tried to cling to the old certainties. She whispered, "They do this for appearances. Do not be fooled. When the war ends, they will show their true face." But her voice lacked conviction. Even she could not ignore the sight of African American nurses correcting German staff with authority, or the fact that every correction improved patient outcomes. Marta said nothing at all anymore. She simply worked, her silence heavier than words. One morning, Ilse assisted in surgery under the supervision of a black nurse named Powell. The instruments gleamed, the lights burned bright, and Ilse's hands trembled as she held a clamp in place. Powell's voice guided her steady, patient, unshaken. When it was over, the patient lived. Ilse stood at the sink afterward, scrubbing her hands, and tears blurred her vision. She had learned more in that hour than in months of training in Germany. And she had learned it from someone she had been taught to despise. The weight of that truth crushed her. The Americans never lectured them about ideology. They did not need to. The lesson was written in every life saved, every patient treated without question, every ward where race and uniform meant nothing. The lesson was brutal in its simplicity. Medicine was not for the chosen. Medicine was for the suffering. By autumn, Ilse no longer whispered excuses. She worked quietly, absorbing everything. Each bandage she wrapped, each dose she administered, felt like a step further from the world she had known. The old faith was gone, shattered not by speeches, but by practice. Watching American nurses white and black treat her comrades and her captors alike, she understood what true power looked like. Not conquest, not ideology, but compassion, armed with knowledge. It broke her heart, and it set her free. Winter fell over the camps with a chill that seeped into bone. But what stunned the German nurses most was not the cold, it was the warmth they did not expect. December brought Christmas, and with it came a flood of contradictions so painful, so tender, that Ilse scarcely knew how to carry them in her heart. She had prepared herself for humiliation, for scorn, for the kind of bitterness that war breeds. Instead, she watched American Red Cross volunteers carry parcels into the barracks, their arms full of boxes wrapped in paper and string. Each nurse received one. Inside, chocolate, coffee, cigarettes, soap, even paper and pencils. Ilse held the bar of chocolate in her palm for a long moment before tasting it. She remembered German children, hollow-eyed, scrounging for crumbs in bombed-out streets. She remembered soldiers whispering their mothers' names as they bled to death without morphine. And here was abundance given not with cruelty, not with calculation, but with something close to kindness. She bit into the chocolate and felt tears burn her eyes. On Christmas Eve, the confusion deepened. Local church groups arrived at the camp, their voices rising in carols sung in careful German. Stille Nacht, Heilig Nacht. The melody filled the air like smoke from a hearth, familiar yet unbearably strange. Children's voices, high and unbroken, carried into the barracks. Some of the nurses covered their faces. Ilse pressed her back against the wall, listening, her throat tightening with each note. These were the enemy's children, singing of peace and tenderness to women branded as part of the Reich. She did not understand. She could not understand. The feast that followed was more than overwhelming, it was shattering. Turkey, ham, vegetables, bread, desserts laid out in a spread that dwarfed anything she had seen in years. Prisoners and captors alike sat to eat, and for a moment, the war seemed to pause at the edge of the table. Ilse ate slowly, each bite heavy with memory. The rations cut thinner and thinner back home, the gaunt faces of soldiers in Cherbourg, the nights when she had gone without so her patients might eat. Here, she could not reconcile what she saw with what she had been told. The Americans were supposed to be decadent, selfish, weak. Instead, they shared. The holidays passed, but the bewilderment lingered. It deepened when classes began. The nurses were brought into lecture halls, shown medical texts, taught by American officers who spoke not with arrogance but with an eagerness to share. For the first time, Ilse was invited to question, to debate, to raise her hand without fear. She had been trained under rigid hierarchies, where obedience mattered more than curiosity. Here, the Americans encouraged disagreement. Why? They would ask. What do you think? The words felt dangerous and liberating all at once. Then came the books, shelves of journals and research papers, bound in English but carrying names that struck Ilse like knives, Jewish names. Scientists she had been taught to dismiss, to scorn, to erase from memory. And yet their work filled the pages with discoveries that had already saved lives. Advances in surgery, in blood chemistry, in pharmacology. The contradiction clawed at her chest. She had memorized lessons on racial purity, on the necessity of removing undesirable influences from medicine. Now, those very influences were the foundation of the abundance she had seen, the techniques that had healed her comrades, the knowledge that reached across oceans and battle lines. One evening she sat at her desk, a borrowed lamp casting pale light on the open journal before her. Her fingers traced the name on the page, letters she had once been taught to despise. She thought of the Jewish neighbors who had vanished from her hometown years before, taken in silence. She thought of the professors who had disappeared from German universities. And here was the proof, in ink and paper, that their minds had not only endured, but had flourished elsewhere, shaping the very medicine, now teaching her to heal. She closed the book and covered her face, her body shaking with sobs she could not stop. The psychological weight grew unbearable. Every kindness, every lesson, every song and every page pressed against the scaffolding of her beliefs until it creaked and splintered. Greta no longer muttered excuses. She sat silently in class, her lips pressed tight, her eyes hollow. Marta began to write notes furiously, as though clinging to knowledge was the only anchor left. For Ilse, the turmoil was constant. She wanted to resist, to guard the old truths, but they slipped through her fingers like sand. At night she dreamed of the cave in Cherbourg, the dying men, the cold stone, the guttering candles. But the dreams twisted, filled with American voices singing carols, with shelves of books carrying forbidden names, with a taste of chocolate that lingered even when she woke. She would open her eyes to the thin barrack ceiling, heart racing, and whisper, "Who am I now?" It was not surrender, not yet. It was not loyalty to her captors. It was something deeper, more dangerous. The recognition that the walls inside her mind were breaking. The Reich had taught her to measure life by race, by worth, by ideology. America was teaching her, without ever meaning to, that life was measured only by suffering and by healing. And so she lived in that fracture, torn between memory and revelation. The carols still echoed. The books still lay open. The chocolate wrapper still hid in her satchel, a small square of paper she could not bring herself to throw away. The war raged far beyond the camp fences, but inside, another war consumed her. A war of belief, of conscience, of identity. And in that war, Ilse was no longer sure which side she belonged to. When the war finally collapsed into silence, in the spring of 1945, the 9 nurses who had once stepped out of Cherbourg's cavern carried more than memories of defeat. They carried notebooks filled with sketches of machines, with copied dosages of penicillin, with diagrams of blood transfusion systems. They carried words overheard in classrooms, ideas that had once been forbidden to speak. But most of all, they carried something weightless and heavy all at once, the knowledge that medicine could be a force of compassion, not ideology. The journey back to Germany was not triumphant. Their homeland was rubble, its cities hollowed by fire, its people gaunt with hunger. Hospitals were ruins, their walls shattered, their wards echoing with the absence of care. In some towns, makeshift clinics operated out of basements, doctors cutting by candlelight as Ilse herself once had in Cherbourg. It would have been easy to despair, to see only ashes and absence. But the women returned with more than despair. They returned with training, with vision, with conviction. At first, their voices met suspicion. They were former prisoners, tainted by American influence. Yet the need was desperate, and desperation overcomes pride. Ilse showed local doctors how to store blood plasma properly, how to cross-match types to avoid the fevers and deaths that had once been so common. Greta demonstrated sterilization techniques with an autoclave jury-rigged from scrap metal. Marta taught younger nurses that bandages could be changed daily, even if it meant tearing old sheets into strips. Each practice seemed small, almost trivial, but the results were undeniable. Patients survived who would once have been lost. Soon, hospitals across the American zone of occupation began to reorganize along the lines these women had seen overseas. Nursing schools opened with new curricula. Student nurses were taught not only obedience, but also observation, judgment, advocacy. "If something is wrong, you must speak," Ilse told them, echoing the American nurses who had once guided her trembling hands. At first, the words sounded foreign in German ears. But in time, they became seeds, planted deep in a soil longing for change. The ripple widened. Blood banks were established. Crude at first, but steadily improved. Antibiotics, once myths in their world, became standards, their use systematic and deliberate. Charts were kept, doses recorded, infections tracked. The very idea of medicine shifted from serving the strong to serving the sick, whoever they might be. That shift was not just technical, it was moral. And with every change, the memory of captivity became less like shame and more like inheritance. They spoke carefully, rarely naming their American teachers, but their practices carried the imprint all the same. Patients noticed, families noticed, survival itself testified. Within a few years, what had once been whispered as foreign methods became accepted as simply medicine. For Ilse, the weight of this transformation was both painful and profound. She remembered too clearly the faces of men who had died in caves, the lies she had whispered when morphine ran out, the certainty with which she had once repeated words of racial destiny. Now she taught young women that every patient mattered, that healing did not ask about uniform or bloodline. When one of her students asked where she had learned such ideas, Ilse paused, her throat tightening. "From those who treated me when I was their prisoner," she said softly. The girl's eyes widened. But she did not look away. She simply nodded. By 1950, many hospitals in the American zone bore the imprint of these lessons. Records show that more than 15 nursing schools were led by former prisoners, their syllabi echoing what had once been taught in Oklahoma and Alabama. German pharmaceutical companies began adopting quality controls they had learned secondhand, discarding old methods of cutting corners. Even the rhythm of hospital life shifted from strict hierarchy and fear to collaboration and accountability. The change was incomplete, imperfect, but undeniable. For the nurses themselves, the transformation was not without scars. They carried the burden of knowing they had once served a system that perverted healing into harm. They carried the knowledge that silence had made them complicit. But they also carried the proof that minds could change, that hands trained to obey could learn to question, that even in captivity, seeds of compassion could take root. One evening, years later, Ilse stood in the corridor of a rebuilt hospital in Stuttgart. The hall smelled faintly of disinfectant, the lights hummed, the wards were alive with voices. She watched a young nurse adjust the blanket on a child, her movements gentle, unhurried. The scene was simple, ordinary, almost forgettable, and yet Ilse felt tears prick her eyes. For in that moment, she saw the journey complete, from darkness to light, from suspicion to care, from ideology to humanity. She thought of that day in Cherbourg when she had whispered, "The Americans cannot possibly have what they claim." How foolish it sounded now, echoing across the years. They had claimed abundance, and they had shown it. But more than abundance, they had shown something deeper, that compassion was not weakness, that knowledge shared freely was stronger than any doctrine shouted from a podium. This was the legacy the nurses carried. Not the shame of defeat, nor the pride of survival, but the quiet, stubborn conviction that healing belonged to all. The enemy had become their teacher. The captor had become the example. And through that paradox, they had learned the most enduring truth. Humanity is stronger than propaganda. From the caves of Cherbourg to the classrooms of Germany, their path traced the arc of transformation from doubt in the dark to awakening in the light. Their story, whispered across wards and lecture halls, reminded every student, every patient, that the heart of medicine is not ideology, but compassion. And in that reminder lay not just the rebuilding of hospitals, but the rebuilding of a nation's conscience. From the darkness of Cherbourg's caves to the bright hospital wards of America, these nurses carried a journey that was as much about healing as it was about transformation. They entered captivity with disbelief, convinced their enemies were weak, yet they left with notebooks filled with knowledge and hearts scarred but awakened. They had seen bandages used once and discarded when they had boiled the same cloth until it fell apart. They had watched prisoners and captors treated side by side, equal in suffering and equal in care. They had been guided by African American nurses whose very presence shattered the doctrines they had once sworn to. And when they returned home, they carried not chains, but seeds. Seeds that rebuilt German medicine on foundations of compassion and science rather than ideology. It is a story of how abundance crushed propaganda, of how kindness proved more powerful than cruelty, and of how even the most indoctrinated minds could change when confronted with undeniable truth. In their lives, we see a simple but profound lesson. Humanity is stronger than hatred. But here's the question: if compassion could transform prisoners into teachers, what could it do for us today? Could the same lesson still speak to a world where division and fear run deep? Tell us what you think. Would you have believed the Americans if you were in those nurses' shoes? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story moved you, hit like so more people can see it. Subscribe for more untold chapters of history, and stay tuned because in the next episode, we'll reveal another forgotten moment when war's cruelty gave way to something far more powerful. After all, history is not just about battles lost and won, it's about hearts changed forever.